Hi, guys. This evening we are going to talk about utopian and reform movements in the early 19th century. Now, we have to look at the roots of this phenomenon first. The roots are actually in the market revolution and particularly in industrialization, which we've already talked about. As we know, the rise of factories and the transformation of the way in which work was done, the reasons for which work was done, and where work was done was incredibly challenging for a lot of people. The adjustment was enormously difficult. It changed why people got up in the morning and what their days looked like. Not necessarily everyone, but for a lot of Americans, this was enormously transformative and also enormously nerve-wracking because change is indeed scary. Here we have the Lowell Mills. Before this, production happened in the home, as we know, and this took a lot of production out of the home and into a separate place that was now called work. And just the difference in the way of thinking about things was enormously disruptive. For many people, their response was to seek comfort in the notion of an ideal place that they could create in order to rediscover the kind of peace and security they felt was lacking in the new world. Now, what you see before you is an illustration from the book Utopia. Now, often when you hear the word utopia, it means an ideal place, the perfect place. Originally, the book Utopia, written by Sir Thomas More in 16th century England, was about a sailor who recounts his visit to the island of Utopia, where everything is perfect, and they do this, that, and the other thing, and it's ideal no matter where you go. Now, Sir Thomas More was writing this with a little bit of a sense of humor because he was also a Latin scholar, and the word utopia actually means nowhere. The idea being that there was no such thing as a perfect place. However, in the early 19th century in the United States, there were many groups that came along that sought to create comfort in so-called utopian communities that answered what they felt was the dislocation of modern society. Now, the first of these, among the earliest of these, were the Shakers. The Shakers actually first originated in England, but later expanded into Albany, New York, and were led by a woman by the name of Mother Ann Lee. The interesting thing about the Shakers is that they felt that God was both male and female, and that therefore men and women were equal. What that meant, however, though, for them was that they needed to abandon traditional family life that created husbands and wives and made the man the head of the household. Men and women in the Shaker communities lived separately and they practiced celibacy, in other words, no sex. And the only way then they could gain members was to draw in converts or to adopt children, which they frequently did. The Shakers were successful economically, and actually they still exist in very, very small numbers today, but their peak was around the 1840s. I thought you'd get a kick out of this. There are some people who still practice Shaker dances, and we're going to take a look at this. There we go.
Let us labor. Come life, shake life, come life eternal. Shake, shake, now be all that is carnal. Come life, shake life, come life eternal. Shake, shake, now be all that is carnal. I'll take the steps, I'll be there. I shall fight twice, I'll be there. I'll take the steps, I'll be there. I shall fight twice, I'll be there. Come life, shake life, come life eternal. Shake, shake, I'll be all that is carnal. Come life, shake life, come like a turtle. Shake, shake, down, beat all legs.
Enough of that. Oh, those wacky shakers. So as you can see from the previous image, that is essentially the dance they were doing. The Oneida community is another of these utopian communities. It was established in upstate New York by John Humphrey Noyes in 1848. Originally, he believed that traditional marriage was stifling and actually was enormously disruptive to a community. So he believed in complex marriage, in other words, where any man could have a sexual relationship with any woman, although she did have the right to refuse. This wasn't exactly free love because they recorded all of their interactions in a book, so the community kept track of these sort of things. And eventually they established a community where they do practice this in Vermont. The problem with this community was that Noyes was increasingly dictatorial and controlling of people's behaviors, and eventually the community fell apart. New Harmony was a different kind of utopian community. Rather than have it based on a religion or a particular philosophy, it was, or I should say social philosophy, it was based on an economic theory. Robert Owen was a Scotsman who came to Indiana to establish New Harmony in 1824. Now, he tried this before in Scotland. What he wanted to do was create a factory town, a factory community that worked harmoniously, where workers were not exploited, where workers shared in the benefits of what was produced, and where everyone was effectively equal, and where, here's the important part, everyone was subservient to the larger community. And for that reason, children were taken from their parents, and wives were not beholden to their husbands, because each individual was accountable exclusively to the community. Now, unfortunately, New Harmony was not remotely harmonious. The settlers fought constantly, particularly over use of the mill, and it really only lasted a few years. Now, you all, hopefully, have read your Emerson and Thoreau in English class, and you are aware that they are transcendentalists, or were transcendentalists. Transcendentalism emerged in the late 1820s in the eastern United States, and transcendentalists, as you know, believed in the inherent goodness of people and the value of nature to dispel the corruption of society and its institutions. Thoreau in particular felt that going back to nature was sort of a check on man that enabled him to reacquaint himself with his reason and with his faith. Among the great adherents were Emerson, Thoreau, but also a very, very interesting woman named Margaret Fuller and Louisa May Alcott. Some of you may have read her works, which included Little Women. They established their own community, Brook Farm in Massachusetts in 1841, but after a fire in 1846, it was sold a year later. Now, these different utopian communities were based largely on philosophies, although the Shakers are indeed considered a Protestant faith or a smaller sect of Protestantism. But one of the most powerful movements that took place in this era and was really the most popular refuge for people who were struggling with all of the changes in the early 19th century was the Second Great Awakening. It was a religious revival that surrounded several different Protestant sects. It actually began in the 1790s, in large part in response to the Revolution, the founding of a new nation, among other things. But it peaks in the 1830s and the early 1840s, in large part in response to the dislocations of the market revolution and the rise of the factory system. Now, it began in the American West, or I should say in the United States, it began in the West, and then it spread to the Northeast, and those were the two regions that had experienced the greatest dislocation in this era. In the West, people were constantly moving. You may move out west, find a great tract of land, and farm it for a year, but you might move a year later, always looking for the bigger, better deal. So communities were inconstant, and it was very difficult for people to ever feel settled. In the Northeast, as we know, all of the dramatic changes really affected people and made them feel equally unsettled, even though they were not necessarily moving themselves. So what they did was seek community in their faith. And what would often happen is they would have these fire and brimstone sermons that would last for days and days and days. They were known as camp meetings, where people would come and stay and commune with one another based on sort of their religious fervor. They were led by itinerant ministers. The most famous in this era was a fellow by the name of Charles Finney of upstate New York, who traveled back and forth, east to west, in New York. And here's what it looked like. Finney described the religious fervor of the era as in upstate New York as burned over, or rather the area in which the evangelical fire caught most powerfully was the burned over district, and it was over here in red. Now, if you notice, the path of these uprisings, or these religious revivals, I should say, follows the path of the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal transformed upstate New York, as we know, and really transformed production. Hundreds of factories grew up around the canal. Transportation was made faster and more efficient, but it also meant that people were constantly moving along the river. Communities exploded. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. And it affected people pretty dramatically. And people in this region, as a result, sought comfort in the awakening. However, the awakening was not the only religious movement that exploded in this era. The Shakers, for example, took root in Albany, New York, over here. Over here is where the Mormons originated. And we've already talked about the Mormons, but the Mormon tradition is founded in this era, is part of this sort of utopian new religion movement that is developing in this era. And the Oneida community was founded here in the middle arrow. So all of this is very definitely interrelated. Now, the awakening was really more of a northern phenomenon. Southerners had not experienced the same dislocations as northerners had. There was a great deal of migration in the South, but they didn't necessarily go as far, and they didn't necessarily move constantly. They would head out to Alabama, they would head out to Mississippi, and then many kind of stayed put because a lot of the people who were moving were planters who merely wanted to create second plantations. So there was a fair amount of stability in terms of where the wealth was located. Also, the South did not really experience a market revolution in the same way. They had far, far fewer factories and significantly less social change as a result. Everything still revolved around the plantation, and there was really no distinction between home and work. The exception to this was, of course, slaves. Slaves were drawn to the egalitarian nature of the awakening, the idea that all men and women were equal in the sight of God, particularly that was preached by the Baptist and the Methodists. And this was very similar to the First Great Awakening, when African slaves were first drawn to Christian religions. And ultimately, this led to the birth of the AME Church, which still exists powerfully. It's the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But in spite of this, the awakening was really more an event that affected the North and the West. Now, what did the awakening believe? This is important. All Christians, ideally, believe that Jesus will return. It's referred to as the second coming. And when Jesus returns, he will judge the living and the dead, and the righteous will ascend into heaven, and the not-so-righteous will go somewhere you don't want to go. Evangelicals believed not only that Jesus was going to come back, but that Jesus' return was imminent. And they felt strongly that they needed to do their best to reform their society in order to make it perfect for Jesus' return. They believed that man could be perfect, and they believed that society could be as well. This led to the expansion of different sects. This led to the powerful contributions of women in particular, who had more time on their hands as a result of the market revolution. And it also consequently led to the growth of a series of very powerful reform movements in this era. Because if Jesus was going to come back, society needed to be perfect. And if society was going to be perfect, they needed to fix a few things. The first was alcohol, and you can see the women in this picture destroying kegs of liquor. Now, this image is really from a later period, more like the turn of the 20th century, but the fact that women are so active in this picture is why I used it, because this was characteristic of the Second Great Awakening and certainly of the reform movements that followed. They were the heart and soul of the American Temperance Society, which was founded in 1826, and their goal was to end drinking altogether. And one of the reasons why women were particularly drawn to this movement is that they felt that alcohol was responsible for many of the ills that plagued the domestic scene of the era. They felt that alcohol use led to poverty because men took their wages and spent it on booze. They felt it led to domestic violence, particularly against wives, but also against children. And they also felt that it contributed to less efficiency in the workplace. And this was one reason why it drew middle class factory managers, among others, because they felt that if they could control the consumption of alcohol by their labor force, they would ultimately make more money. Now, the temperance movement was unsuccessful in achieving a national law, but many states passed what are known as blue laws, which meant that you could not purchase alcohol on Sunday, the Sabbath day. These laws still exist in some states. For example, in the state of Connecticut, you cannot buy alcohol on Sunday. By 1840, they claim to have cut the average American's consumption of alcohol in half, and this is actually plausible because the only day anybody really ever took off was Sunday. So for most people, particularly the working class, their day to drink was Sunday. And by limiting their access to alcohol, the temperance movement did effectively cut their ability to consume it. But it was deeply resented by the working class, who felt that it was more an issue of control and an abuse of the power of middle class reformers than anything else. One of the other very popular reforms was anti-prostitution. Prostitution was actually not illegal in the early 19th century in the United States. Many people, mostly men, saw it as a marital aid. If their wives did not want to have sex with them, they could seek comfort elsewhere. But a lot of women saw it as destructive of the family dynamic of the home. And so many middle-class women set out to make it increasingly difficult for men to seek out prostitutes. What's interesting, though, about these middle-class reformers is that they did not blame the prostitutes themselves. They saw the prostitutes as victims of both poverty and the exploitation of men. They blamed the men. So very often, outside a house of ill repute, otherwise known as a brothel, middle-class reformers would stand and write down the names of men who went in and out with the aim of publishing them in the newspapers and otherwise humiliating them publicly so that it would cut down on their the frequency of their visits. Now, they were largely unsuccessful in getting anything done about prostitution. They were unable to fix the poverty that plagued many poor women, and they were unable to control the men because they had absolutely no political power with which to change the laws. But gradually, they did manage to push for the criminalization of prostitution. The only problem with this is that subsequently, the prostitutes themselves were often the victims rather than the men who sought their services. One of the most significant of the reform movements of this era was led by a fellow named Horace Mann. Now, Horace Mann wanted his particular reform, the reform of education, to perfect society by creating a more egalitarian society. He believed strongly that a free public education would level the playing field. It would mean that poor and rich would interact with one another and get to know each other, but it would also enable poor people to rise in society, or particularly poor children, to grow up and rise in society and better their place in society with the help of education. He was enormously successful in convincing many people to support this cause. By 1860, every single northern state had a tax-funded public school system. The South, however, did not. We're going to talk more about this later, but one of the main reasons was that they did not want to promote an egalitarian society. Southern society was based on a very strict hierarchy that was both racial and socioeconomic, and they did not want to promote the idea that the poor could indeed rise. The South would not get a state-funded public school education until after the Civil War. One of the important things about education, or one of the many important things about this reform movement in education, was that it provided single women with a career opportunity. Not because people thought that women would necessarily make great teachers of men. Women were confined to elementary education. No one expected a woman to become a college professor. But it was seen for a woman as an extension of her so-called natural role as a mother and a nurturer. So this did open up career opportunities for women because it seemed to suit the gender roles that had been pretty strongly established as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The one problem with educational reform and its connection to the Second Great Awakening was that the schools that were created were steeped in Protestant theology. And the movement was really pushed by Protestants, which meant that Catholic school children in urban areas felt deeply excluded and were treated something as pariahs. And what this does, though, is inspire Catholic communities in places like Boston and New York and eventually Chicago to create their own parochial school system as a counter to the very, very Protestant public school system. Last but not least, prison and asylum reform. You cannot have a perfect society if many of its members are broken. And these reforms were designed to cure both criminality and mental illness and reintegrate the criminal and the mentally ill back into society in productive ways. This is why prisons became known as penitentiaries. I'm sure if anybody has gone to church, they hear the word penitent or they hear the word penance. If you have sinned, you must pay your penance. You must be penitent. Well, the idea behind prison reform was that it was a place where the criminal could repent their sins and gradually work their way back into society. For the mentally ill, the pioneer was this woman here, Dorothea Dix, who investigated abuses of the mentally ill in states around the country, actually north and south, and pushed hard for the development of larger state institutions for the care of the mentally ill. She advocated, rather than locking them up and letting them sort of wallow in their own misery, moral treatment, or as she called it, based on the principles of modesty, chastity, and delicacy. Now, I'm not quite sure how well this worked, but so be it. She is certainly famous for this and for drawing attention to the fact that the mentally ill had been egregiously abused for quite some time. Here we go. Tomorrow we're going to talk about these questions. So take a look at these, and if you need to, go back to the slideshow and see if you can gather some information, some evidence to help support a position on any of these questions. Make sure you've got your IDs ready to go, and I will see you tomorrow.